dear colleagues from different countries. I'm very proud to be here with you and to have a chance to share my experience with the Eastern Partnership Civil Society Fellowship and to speak about my project as an example of influencing public policy. To just very briefly introduce myself, my name is Lado Javakhishvili and I am from Georgia. By training, I'm a public policy administration professional and a lawyer, and have experience of working on I would say, both sides, from public administration position as a policymaker. I held several positions in the Ministry of Justice of Georgia for about a decade, and I also have a experience of working on the side of civil society since 2021. I was engaged in several projects. I'm running a non-governmental organization in Georgia, Institute for Democracy and Justice, and I have also experience on working on national and international level too, with different organizations on influencing policy, not only concerning the justice system and rule of law, but youth engagement and different topics. What I'm going to do today is just to try to share my experience and tools I'm using during the policy analysis and policy advocacy process, and to just share the practice and to share the example which I used during my project within the framework of Eastern Partnership Civil Society Fellowship. I would say that in all types of the civil society activism plays a crucial role and is very important in any types of society, including the countries where maybe very, very restrictive context in terms of civil society organizations and civil activism. And it may sometimes seem to be very difficult from this position to try to influence public policy, but there are always tools to have some influence on the policymaking process, including different models, for example, the shadow reporting or service providing, watchdog activities, and etc., etc., etc. So a lot of tools. So it's always very important in every context and every situation to have a strong civil society, strong civil activists, and to base your policy advocacy on very, very specific models. What model do I use for this? I mostly align on the Bardach's eightfold model, which is, in my opinion, very, very specific and very, very comfortable tool to use, because it gives you a very nice way to go from very first step to the end of the process. And this eightfold model includes different steps. First step is defining the problem. Second step is assembling the evidence. And then you go to the constructing alternatives process, and you select the criteria to assess the alternatives, and then you project your outcomes based on criteria. Then you confront trade-offs and make a decision which alternative to choose. And at the end, you try to share outcomes to the public, to tell your story to your colleagues or to different stakeholders, to just the general public, or etc. I'll just try to go through all these steps very briefly based on my experience and based on my project. So as we already mentioned, the first step is defining the problem, which may feel and seem to be, for me personally, it may seem to be most difficult, because at this moment, I have a chaos in my mind. I have a lot of dozens and tons of the ideas, and it always feels for me to be very hard and difficult to find a very, very specific definition of the problem. But trust me, it's one of the most important part of policy analysis, because at this step you need to create a very, very specific, very measurable, and very direct uh, 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 definition of the problem. For example, in my project, which was about child victims' rights protection, I use the definition, the lack of comprehensive legal and psychosocial protection of child victims in the criminal justice system, which I think may not be the perfect, because it lacks a measurable component, and it's not always easy to create a very, very measurable definition of the problem, but still I think that it shows the main idea of the policy analysis, and it gave me a chance to base next steps on this idea. And what's the next step? Next step is assembling the evidence. And during this phase, it is very important to gather all types of evidence and to have a strong evidence to influence the policymakers and to give a strong idea to your colleagues and other people what you're going to do and what your basis of your judgment. In the evidence, we mean different types of evidence: qualitative data, quantitative data. On this type, you can use desk research tools, you can use interviews, you can use secondary data. For example, I used mostly statistics. I requested statistics from different governmental organizations and different law enforcement agencies. I did, and I worked on case studies. I studied also a legal framework, national and international legal framework. I also studied regulations and recommendations from international organizations, and also gathered best practices from different countries and conducted expert interviews with field experts. On next step, you need to construct alternatives based on the evidence you gathered during the previous step. And at this stage, I personally always try to gather as much alternatives and construct as much alternatives as I can. Long-term alternatives, short-term solutions, high cost, low cost, even sometimes unbelievable alternatives, but as much as I can. And for example, several examples from my study was child-friendly spaces in courthouses, creation of child-friendly spaces in courthouses, continuing specialization for justice system professionals, and long-term and short-term psychosocial services. These are just brief examples what type of alternatives I constructed during my policy analysis process. On next step, which is step 4, you need to create a criteria for evaluation and assessment of the alternatives. I always try to be very, very, very objective during this process. Even though all alternatives are prepared by me, I always try to create an objective criteria to assess my judgment. And these criteria may be a cost effectiveness, cost benefit analysis, maybe a feasibility, maybe a political acceptability. And this part is especially important in different countries where the environment may be a restrictive. It may be a sustainability criteria, it may be effectiveness criteria. You may use some already existing tools, but you definitely need to assess all your alternatives which you created during the previous step. And during this process, for example, for my project, I used the criteria, for example, how can these options be practical? For example, how is practical to create special interviewing rooms or child-friendly rooms in the courthouses where maybe no, there maybe not be enough room for even judges and court hearings. And for example, I use the criteria, for example, how affordable is the continuous education and capacity building activities for justice system, and how the budget terms work in terms of trainings, how effectively we can reduce the trauma in the justice system, and secondary victimization problems and victimization problems with the psychosocial services or etc. Now, after this step, next you move to the projecting outcomes of each alternative, and you create scenarios how the system can develop in this if you consider this alternative, and how the system can change, how the processes can develop in the future based on this solution. And I use during this time scenarios, use case studies, and in this project I did not, but I suggest to use statistical modeling or other evidence-based modeling tools to measure and to project the outcomes, possible outcomes in the future. Next step is it's called confront trade-offs, and on this step I mostly do a cost effectiveness analysis and cost benefit analysis, and I mostly try to compare budget with the impact with the alternative can bring to the society and to the policy changes. And I try to work on short-term and long-term benefits too, and consider both of the types of the benefits. For example, during the project I was working in terms of Eastern Partnership Fellowship, a Civil Society Fellowship project. I worked on cost effectiveness of child-friendly spaces, and how much this environment may cost, how much the technical part can cost, and how much this can bring us to the real outcomes for children who are in the system of justice and who need to be protected. The same I did with all other alternatives. For example, I measured the costs of the continuous education, how much it may cost for the government to create training modules and conduct trainings each year and each 6 months, and compared it how beneficial it may be, and how these trainings can really change attitudes of the professionals in the justice system. The same was also about the psychosocial services offered in the system, and the cost benefit analysis of all other alternatives. The next step is making a decision on the best alternatives. In some cases, it may be only one alternative, but in my practice, it's never only one. It's always a very comprehensive process. It's always a very complex process, and you need always several alternatives. But still, you need to choose very specific, very clear, and very goal-oriented alternatives based on a whole judgment you did before. And it's this step you have to take into consideration all evidences you gathered or projected outcomes you created, all stakeholder mapping you created. For example, I made a decision to use the video testimonies for children, remote video testimony model for children who are in the system of justice and who are victims of crime, and also all other alternatives too. And the final step after making a decision on alternatives is to share them to the public. Sometimes sharing the story, you may need to share it only with your colleagues or only with your allies who work with you, who you trust, especially in the situation when there is a restrictive environment in the country. But sometimes in reverse, you need to share to the broader public to give understanding to the society. For example, in my case, I used a lot of visuals, a lot of statistics, a lot of personal stories. I use traditional media, and I used also social networks to share the ideas, because with this policy paper, on the one hand, I wanted to influence the policy making and decision making process and the whole system. But on the other hand, I was aiming to change the attitudes of the society to the child victims and to raise their interests in the child victims protection issues, and to gather the interests of the society around this idea. After this, my recommendation is never to forget to your project, revise it periodically, and reread the paper you write, and just come back to the idea and evaluate the outcomes. Just try to monitor how your policy paper or your policy brief can and made already changes to the policy decisions. The very practical tips from my experience is that for me, it's very helpful to use stakeholder mapping during the policy analysis process, because I really very much need to find good allies, other civil activists, other civil society organizations, any type of governmental organizations who may be interested to work with me on this topic. For example, the Ombudsman's Office or Public Defender's Office may be a good ally in terms of child victims protection issues, or etc. And on the other hand, I very much find useful to have a mapping of opponents to create very good strategies and to create a good alternatives to oppose them, and to have idea what may be may opposed sides suggest, for example, in terms of, say, budget restraints, or in terms of political restraints, or etc. Also, it is, for me, it's very beneficial to build the coalitions and not only work as a separate person or separate organization, but to work with like-minded people, with my colleagues who have the same understanding of the issue. And in these terms, it's very beneficial to also use shared resources. And the final part of the policy analysis for me is the creation of policy brief or policy paper. And I find it very hard to write in a concise and I find it very hard to write small documents, especially because I'm as I'm trained as a lawyer, I'm used to writing a complex and huge documents, but in the policy analysis and for the policy papers, you definitely always need to be very clear, and to make the document very short and small. My recommendation is to use a lot of visuals, a lot of statistics, and to make it for a reader to easy to read the paper. For policy advocacy, for this project, for example, I used roundtable and workshop. I gathered different stakeholders from government organizations. Some of them were ready to cooperate. Some of them even did not show up to the meeting. But still, this part is very important to hear their feedback. to give them the clear idea what you are aiming with the policy analysis and with the policy paper. And this gives you a chance to create a dialogue. But sometimes it's not possible. And if it's not possible, you can use other types of policy advocacy, for example, public campaigns, which I also used during my project. I used, as I already mentioned, the traditional media to share the outcomes of the project and to share the results of the research. I used also social media tools. I even used TikTok for sharing the results of my research. It really depends on what type of audience you need to reach. And I also used the tool, and I also shared these results and policy brief and policy paper to different stakeholders, officially sent them with letters, and also shared it with the international organizations who can, on the other hand, help in advocacy and help to pressure sometimes the policymakers in the governmental institutions. There are also different tools which I was thinking to use. For example, I was thinking to use petitions and open letters, but I considered that it would not work as well as other tools in terms of this project. But there are a lot of policy issues where you can use petitions or open letters as really very good tools for influencing the local or national or different types of, say, government. I guess this is very briefly about my project and about my experience and about the model I used during the project in the framework of Eastern Partnership Civil Society Fellowship. And I would really be very happy to hear your questions or your comments. You can use the chat option, or you can use question and answer option for asking questions too.
Thank you very much, Lado. And in the meantime, I have a question, if I can ask you. I think that we know that civil society activists can be quite good on campaigning and can be quite good at mobilizing supporters. But often the criticism of civil society in terms of contributing to policy development is the weakness of the research and analysis which is done in trying to contribute to a particular policy area. I just wondered, from your experience, I mean, is there any practical tips that you could give in terms of how to strengthen the evidence that you want, the case you want to present? You know, what do you need to ensure is there is what's backing up your argument for why the policy reform should take place?
Yeah, it's a really, really great question. In my experience, the evidence gathering phase is very important part. We as a civil society representatives or as civil activists or a lot of policymakers also base their decisions on just personal attitudes and personal understandings. And there are a lot of biases and a lot of prejudice in these decisions. So it's very hard to find a good evidence because a lot of topics are not discussed well in academic environment. There are not a lot of statistics. For example, when I was working on child victims rights project, there were a few numbers and few statistical information about how many victims are in Georgia, but still you can find different sources. You can combine these different sources, and you always need to create evidence, and you should always base your decisions on evidence. Because for me personally, I find a lot of times in my experience that my biases and my prejudice were very different from the reality, very different from numbers, very different from statistics, very different from evidence. And sometimes you feel that it is very, very good idea to use different alternatives, and but still other countries' experience shows that it did not work. So it may feel in a theory that it's great, but it cannot work in practice. So that's why you need to gather evidence inside your country, inside your society, inside your community you are going to influence and trying to influence, and also practices of other countries and other municipalities or other systems which have already done this. The Bardach shows us a very nice example. This is it's called a $1 test. So sometimes when you see $1 in the street, you should think that why is it there? Why other person have not tried to take it from the ground? So you need to think if your alternatives are really going to work, and try to find some examples from the fellow countries or fellow societies who have already made some mistakes and made some solutions.
Thank you. I like that the $1 on the street reminder. That's a great way of thinking about it. Thanks, Lado.